What it is, folks, my name is Batman, and Call of Duty is developing a PR problem right now. I think it may be in the process of potentially earning a fatal label as a game for little kids, right? We've all heard it before, Call of Duty is for little kids. It's their own fault, really, for a number of reasons that I want to get into, and I do think Ghost has taken some steps to shed that label, which I will also get into. Because I think the developers understand that it is very important that they do shed this label, because otherwise they're going to be taken less and less seriously by the demographic of gamers that matter most, teenagers and young adults, because the little kid label is toxic with this demographic, because young people coming into maturity don't want to be associated with what they or society deems little kid things, right? It's a natural tendency, and one that develops at a very early age. For instance, how old were you when you decided it was embarrassing to admit that you still watched Power Rangers? I was 12. I remember I had a friend who was 2 years older than me, and we would play Pokemon cards and play Pokemon video games, and then one year he stopped playing and started calling it Pokemon, and that made me want to punch him in his fucking face. How old were you when you were embarrassed to admit that you're a virgin? Not that there's anything wrong with virginity or watching Power Rangers, or even playing Pokemon for that matter, but I'm sure we are all aware that for whatever reason, the human condition naturally frowns upon the inadequacies of youth. And just as people become embarrassed to admit that they're a virgin, so too will folks start becoming embarrassed to admit that they play Call of Duty. And I speak from personal experience. It's not that I'm embarrassed if somebody knows I play Call of Duty, but I played MW3 in the Black Ops 2 campaigns, and there were several instances throughout those campaigns where I just felt kind of silly. For example, the last level in MW3, you start out in a juggernaut suit, and you're walking down this highway towards this building, and you're just straight up out in the open, getting shot at by everything from every direction, and you have this minigun, and you're invincible because you're in this juggernaut suit, and you spray everyone down as you march towards the entrance. And I get that it's a scene that's supposed to look and feel badass, kind of like Terminator style, but I remember thinking, man, this is just so unrealistic. Like, if this were a movie, it would be a silly movie. It didn't feel gritty, it felt like a cheap ripoff of the 1980s RoboCop. And then, in Black Ops 2, do you remember that sequence where you're fighting on horseback in the desert, and you're riding on your horse fighting these fucking Soviet tanks? And if they did that in a movie, at the movie theaters, the audience would be laughing. And if I was a little kid, if I was 9 years old, I could get immersed in that and genuinely believe that for whatever reason a horse could somehow outrun and dodge multiple heavy tanks. It would be a fun sequence, but I'm not a fucking child anymore. I don't believe that horses can outrun tanks. And I've seen Saving Private Ryan and Jarhead and The Hurt Locker and Black Hawk Down, you know, these movies that have tried very hard to present a true version of real combat. I saw Restrepo, which is a really brutal documentary about this platoon that had to hold down this really shitty position in the Afghanistan mountains, and it's got real gunfights in it. Like, if you've ever enjoyed watching those YouTube videos of real gunfights, you'll really like this movie. It's called Restrepo. It's on Netflix. Go check it out. It's the real deal. Like, it's a real documentary. And it's like, after getting an impression of what the real combat is all about, when you go back to fighting from horseback against tanks, it literally feels like an insult, like a slap in the face to anyone who's been in real combat, or anyone who's tried to communicate authentic combat to an audience. And I get that it's a video game and it can't be completely realistic, but I think there's a balance that can be struck, and COD has struck that balance in the past. Call of Duty 4 and MW2, you know, there were a lot of unrealistic moments, like in COD 4, when you have to shoot the propeller off the helicopter, and then you're carrying your commander on your shoulder through the streets and fighting off a whole bunch of enemies and escaping to the helicopter, and you know, all the James Bond style snowmobile fights. MW2 when you're fighting Russians in the White House. Like, it's completely unrealistic, but it didn't feel silly. It just kind of felt like a cool alternate reality. The first time I think I felt kind of silly in a COD campaign was probably towards the end of MW2, when you bust out the riot shield and you're fighting on the cliffside against this American general who somehow has built his own shadow army without the government noticing or having a problem with it. And that's when things started to go a little overboard, but only a little, and only at the last level. And maybe it's just because I'm getting older. I'm 19 now, but when I was playing the Ghost campaign, I literally quit after the 4th mission because it was just so silly. Like, I'll play along with the Odin strikes in South America launching a couple dozen terrorist operatives into a space station that without any scientific explanation can launch something stronger than a nuclear strike, which for some reason has no negative effects on the world around it, and they sink the entire US, which I'm assuming means they had to also destroy all of Western Europe, which begs the question, how did the world economy survive? But again, I'll play along with all that. It's just that eventually it reached a point where it felt dumb. When I'm this dog with a camera on its back sneaking around this enemy convoy in broad fucking daylight, eating several people's throats out without anyone noticing. When we're attacking that stadium in the 3rd level and the plan is to blow up some cars at the front gate, and then we just drive our truck right into the middle of the fucking stadium, and there's just like 4 dudes in a car with the windows rolled down shooting out the windows, and with bad guys lining the stands of the stadium, and then the dog jumps out of the fucking window and starts mauling some dude. I get that it's supposed to feel badass, but it just felt like something out of a 3rd grader's daydream during class. It was cheesy almost. The badass effect was totally shit on because I was laughing out loud at how preposterous the situation was. And you know, I'm sure I would have been very immersed, again, if I was a little kid. And of course, it's not just the campaigns. You know, you go back to COD 4, World at War, MW2. For the most part, the maps felt like actual battlefields. But in the course of the next 3 games, the maps became more and more absurd. By Black Ops 2, the majority of the maps had degenerated into things like yachts, Playboy mansions, skate parks, a snowboard park, a golf course, a paintball course, a hockey stadium, a concert stadium, Hollywood studios with a fucking fake T-Rex animation thing that they probably put more time into than they put into reskinning that map. It really just felt incredibly silly. Now, to be fair, I do think Ghosts has tried to move away from these aspects. Obviously, their maps feel a little more like authentic battlefields. You know, they kind of cut back on the paintball courses and whatnot. And again, I think that's because they recognize that the little kid label is potentially fatal. Especially now that Battlefield is on the rise on consoles, which, keep in mind, has a much larger chunk of the gamer market share. Because it used to be that console gamers might buy Battlefield, but because it was still capped on 30 frames per second and 12v12 on 32v32 maps, it couldn't really stand as a solid alternative to Call of Duty. It was so handicapped in 2 very important areas. So there was a good chance that said gamer would still prefer COD even if he did like Battlefield, which was kind of the case with me. And ultimately that's what led me to get Battlefield on the PC. But now that Battlefield has closed the gap with Call of Duty in both graphics and pacing, it can present itself as a clear alternative. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is going to like Battlefield more, but it means that unlike before, there's actually going to be some competition. Like if this was a track race, Battlefield on the pre-gen consoles was running with fat ankle weights on, and COD didn't even have to break a sweat. But now, Battlefield's ankle weights are off, and that doesn't necessarily mean Battlefield is faster, but it means COD is going to have to actually try, and that means COD developers are going to have to actually assess what areas Battlefield might be outperforming them. And I suspect maturity will be something continually brought up in the focus groups. Everyone I've talked to about this, who has played both games, even if they still like Call of Duty more, or if they're kind of like me, like they like both for different reasons, they always communicate in one way or another that Battlefield has a more matured vibe to it, which is something I agree with. And again, I wouldn't have agreed with that back in COD 4 or with any of the World at War Call of Duties, but a good representation of the current state of each game can be found in the first campaign level of each game. When you compare the scene in Battlefield where the 3 soldiers are stuck in the sinking Jeep and the commander is like, leave me behind. You know, I was engaged in that scene. I was thinking, boy, oh boy, would that fucking suck to be in that situation. How fucking creepy. I hope I never crash my car underwater. I was thinking, goddamn, if I were that guy, I'd be like, fuck that. Cut me out of this goddamn chair. Swim me to shore, motherfuckers. I want to go home. And you compare that to the scene in Call of Duty where the 2 random astronauts have just finished up a massive space firefight and are shooting the control panel on the Odin cannon, which in the last 30 seconds has nuked a few dozen major cities. You know, I didn't feel a thing when they sacrificed themselves. I was like, this kind of reminds me of that Sandra Bullock movie or that Bruce Willis movie with the asteroid, and then I laughed out loud when that piece of metal strikes your astronaut commander in the fucking face. I was like, good, that girl's voice was making my eardrums bleed, because it's just not immersive. I can't imagine myself in that situation. I can't imagine anyone in that situation, because I don't think anyone will ever be in anything close to that situation. And maybe part of the problem is the strict adherence to the modern military shooter. You know, obviously Black Ops 2 and Ghosts kind of take place in the future, but not very far in the future, still well within all our lifetimes. Everything in the game seemed pretty similar to life now, and when you're operating within those circumstances, it's harder to generate these sort of fantastical scenarios, just because for many people like myself, it's going to be hard not to point out the lack of reality when the situation is presenting itself basically as our current reality, right? Modern military shooters in general, I think, have just been way oversaturated. I mean, since 2008, for the last 5 years, excluding Halo, it has been nothing but modern military shooters. I do think it's time to start cracking open the sci-fi box again, and I think developers are trending in that direction. Obviously, Ghost trends in that direction, but they need to be more decisive and just take it all the way. Not this strange half ground where it's a sci-fi twist on modern day combat. The reason Halo's universe was so entertaining was because it was so far in the future you could believe to an extent the intense imaginative scenarios. Like, do you remember the first level of Halo 2 when the Chief takes the Covenant bomb and like jumps out into the vacuum of space with it and lands inside a Covenant cruiser with it and blows the thing up? That was such a badass moment. Completely unbelievable, but completely badass, and I was immersed in it just because I wanted to be immersed in it. And every time I saw that cutscene to this day, I'm like, oh shit, it's on now, motherfucker. It was totally unrealistic because I don't think it would be that easy for someone to navigate the vacuum of space. But because it was so far in the future, and because Bungie made a point of having some kind of scientific explanation behind all their shit, shoddy as that explanation might be to a real scientist, it worked. It was enough for my mind to reject the rejection of the notion of immersion. And I think Call of Duty is preying on the sensationalist weakness of little children everywhere. They are little more than creepy old men in vans offering free lollipops to anyone who gets inside. I yearn for a return to the era in which story led the masses and not the other way around, when developers seized the opportunity to leave an imprint on society, not to grotesquely leech off its many inadequacies, inaccuracies, and willful, gleeful misunderstandings. May the Force guide us. This is Batman, signing out.